I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, maybe 14 or 15. There was this eccentric guy who lived on my street. Everyone called him Crazy Mike, and he truly lived up to the name. But more on him in a minute. I had this one friend who was a little wild. Let's call him Charlie. He was an adventurous friend who always pushed us to do crazy things. For about 2 or 3 months, we hung out a lot, and it was honestly a blast. One of our favorite activities was exploring the nearby woods. There was a lot of wildlife, and we'd hike up the mountain and, after a day of adventure, take the regular roads back down for an easier route home. My friend lived a few roads up from me, so I'd walk to his house with him and then head home alone. One particular day stands out. We were hiking through the creek, and it was freezing outside. There was snow on the ground, and parts of the water were frozen. We had the bright idea of walking on the ice, and predictably, we fell in. It wasn't too deep, just enough to get us wet up to our chests. But being the adventurous kids we were, it didn't stop us. We carried on hiking, completely soaked for a couple of hours. Looking back, I don't know if we had an exceptionally high tolerance for the cold, or if it was just adrenaline, but we were fine. However, I hit a point where I started feeling dangerously cold. I knew my body and sensed I might be nearing hypothermia. When we got to Charlie's house, he was kind enough to offer me a place to warm up for a bit. But just as we were getting there, my mom called. She was furious because I hadn't answered my phone for an hour. Despite my explanation, she kept screaming at me to come home. Reluctantly, I had to walk the rest of the way. This is where Crazy Mike comes into the picture. He lived one road above me, and cutting through a part of his property saved me about 10 minutes of walking. He had a big fence, but so did his neighbor, leaving a small walkway between the two properties. In a rush to warm up, I jogged through his property, assuming it would be okay. However, as I went through, he emerged from his house with an assault rifle, screaming like a maniac. Naturally, I turned around and sprinted away. Arriving home, I told my mom, but she dismissed it, insisting I shouldn't have trespassed on people's property. That incident led me to inquire about Crazy Mike. People shared unsettling stories, painting him as a conspiracy theorist, drug dealer, and criminal. Nobody had anything good to say about him. This made me uneasy because I still had to pass his house on my way home, even though I no longer cut through his property. I was constantly anxious about potential altercations. What unsettled me more was the discovery of cameras on his property, manually operated and focusing on the road. I noticed they followed me every time I walked by. It made me uncomfortable, knowing he was watching me closely. Even on late walks home, as late as 10 or 11 at night, the cameras tracked my movements. I hoped that would be the end of my encounters with Crazy Mike, but I was wrong. During that same winter, I was walking home in a blizzard. Passing by Crazy Mike's fence, a part suddenly opened and a dog bolted out, barking aggressively at me. I could sense the hostility, and it chased me. Fortunately, I managed to outrun it without slipping or getting bitten. Luckily, a few weeks later, my family moved for unrelated reasons, and that was the end of my unnerving experiences with Crazy Mike. To this day, I wonder what his deal was. Was he a drug dealer or a paranoid criminal? I've asked friends, but nothing seems to have changed. The moral here? Avoid encounters with unpredictable individuals, as even just walking in front of their house might set them off. I don't know how common the trope of the guy who went to the store to get some cigarettes and never came back is in today's virulent anti-smoking world. However, in my youth, it was still alive and well until an incident like this occurred to a friend of mine. I'd always thought it was an excuse. Mothers used to explain to their children why their fathers had left them. To my surprise, when I was a junior in high school, I discovered how true this excuse was. My friend's dad had been working undercover for the local PD for as long as I'd ever known. Although he would often go extended periods without being in contact with his family, they almost always knew he was working on a case and would return when he completed it. Then one morning, he was just gone. It was a cold and quiet winter day, the kind most folks don't go out in, but he had insisted. He was out of cigarettes and would be right back once he had gotten them. He had just returned home from a case that had kept him away for over 4 months, and his family was desperate to spend some quality time with him. From all appearances, he'd planned to return, leaving his badge and gun behind. He'd simply thrown on a light coat and drove away into the unknown. The investigation to find him was very hot for a while, but would eventually fizzle out. A lot of important questions were going unanswered, mainly from the side of the police department. His wife was stonewalled at every turn, especially when it came to the nature of his cases. The department would only say that his job was wide and varied. After not hearing anything new and not getting the answers she wanted for nearly 2 years, his wife hired a PEI who used to be a local officer, hoping he'd have an easier time getting the information. He agreed to take the case, but she went almost 3 months without hearing from him. Just when she was starting to think she'd been scammed by the man, she received a very important phone call. The PEI called her down to his office and gave her all she'd been looking for, and so much more. It turned out he'd certainly been earning his money, almost an entire month after he began the investigation. He discovered that her husband had been working undercover in the state and sometimes national drug trade on and off for 15 years. His most recent case, before his death, was undercover in a local meth cooking and trafficking group that had ties to Mexico. When the investigation wrapped up and arrests were made, he went back home. Unfortunately, it turned out that a couple of the people involved in the trafficking end had to be cut loose due to some technicality. They figured out her husband was undercover. They discussed this with their connections in Mexico and said connections demanded they kill him. Generally, in the States, traffickers don't go after cops. It's always been kind of an unspoken rule. But no such belief is held across the border. To maintain a good working relationship, they agreed. It took a short time for them to find the officer and where he lived. Then, one cold and quiet winter morning, they caught him on a trip to the store. All this information was unknown to the police until around a year after her husband's disappearance. A jailhouse snitch came forth with a story he had overheard and wanted to trade it for a deal on his case. Once they heard it, he was given the deal. Now that they had the information and some names, the department moved forward by planting another undercover in the organization. Considering what had happened in the past, the police knew the suspects would be very leery. So, the officer had to take his time gaining their confidence. He did just what he needed to do and eventually compiled all the proof required to end the trafficking and convict the murderers of her husband. The PEI had known all about the investigation for a little while, but was unable to say anything until arrests were made. That morning, he had called her to give her all his findings. The arrests had begun, and he was given the okay to let her in on everything he knew. The PEI told her that, in his entire time in and out of law enforcement, he'd never heard of a cop being allowed to stay on undercover work for as long as her husband, especially in a local capacity. A couple of the other narcotics cops told him off the record that they had heard that her husband had been asking to transfer out of the unit, but the transfers kept getting blocked. This last tidbit of information was quickly followed up with a reminder that the police department rarely admits when it's at fault for something, and she should give up on the idea of anyone connected to it accepting any guilt in his death. She took his advice and thanked him for all his hard work. In the following weeks, the remains of her husband would be recovered and given a proper funeral. I attended the service, and it had an air of bittersweetness to it. Everyone had given up hope of him being alive long ago and were just happy to have him back and know what had happened. I would soon go off to college and lose contact with my friend, but I did keep up on the case and was happy to see his dad's murderers were convicted. They have both since been executed, and I hope they're burning in hell. I have a horrible story from my past. It makes me feel uncomfortable, and this is probably the only way I can ever really tell anyone about it. I had your typical big, happy family. Everyone loved each other, and everything was really good. Lots of aunts, uncles, cousins, and especially people your age. There were probably about 30 of us, and we all spent a lot of time together and were all close. However, not everyone in the family was a good egg, and here comes my Uncle Ron. He hadn't been in the picture for a long time because he was in prison. I didn't know what he was in prison for at that time. I was young, after all. Kids shouldn't know that kind of stuff. He was always kind of a family mess-up, and everyone tried their best to help him. But from what I've heard, he just didn't want to help himself. People would give him a place to stay, and he would do drugs on the couch. People would try to get him a job, and he would steal stuff while working. That's the kind of person he was. He was getting out of prison right after Christmas. It was really cold. We live in a really cold area, and winters are particularly harsh. So, it would have just been a little inhumane to let him fend for himself. Everyone knew that if someone didn't give him a place to stay, he would probably end up back in the system or dead. And as frustrated as everyone was with him, no one wanted to see that. Everyone wanted him to succeed, the adults at least. But I was a kid, and I didn't understand the situation. I was only 13 at the time, but that didn't stop him from giving me some creepy looks. I hit puberty young, and already had the body of a young woman, if you know what I mean. I remember him coming over one day when he had first got out. My dad was going to clear out a place for him to sleep in our shed. Our house was not that big, but if he cleared out some tools and whatnot, there was a good amount of space in the shed for him to stay. It was not the most ideal, but it did have electricity and a little space heater. Heck, it was a free place to stay. It was hard to argue with him. It wasn't like my dad forced him to stay out there all the time, just to sleep there. I think my dad was trying to protect me and my brother from seeing Uncle Ron hiding on the couch. About 2 weeks went by, and he seemed like he was changing. He was going for jobs and applying, and my dad seemed impressed. I remember him saying that Ron seemed like he was getting his life together. It wasn't long before he had a steady job and had some money to spend. One of the first things he did was buy a cell phone, and I remember him asking me to help set it up. Of course, I was more than willing to help, especially being a kid. Technology is one of the only ways I could have helped anyone, and I was excited to do so. He bought a cheap flip phone, and it wasn't all that difficult to set up. I almost questioned why he needed help at all. I remember a few minutes after we were messing around with some of the features, he took a picture of me, thinking that I wasn't looking. I noticed him take the picture. It was very obvious. That whole situation made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know how to confront him about it, though. At the time, I convinced myself that he had just accidentally taken the picture by mistake, and he deleted it right after. Despite having a job, he still had a lot of time to hang out and play around. I remember he specifically played with me and my brother a lot. But here's the weird thing that he did. He bought my brother a new gaming console that must have been at least $300 or $400. He didn't get me anything though, so whenever he wanted to play with us kids, my brother just ended up playing video games. He was hooked on that thing. I think it was an Xbox. So that just left me and Uncle Ron to play alone. And that was when we started playing a new game. We would fake wrestle or maybe play wrestle. I'm sure you know what I mean. When you're a kid and you wrestle an adult and they kind of let you have a chance, even though you know they are way stronger than you. Anyway, we started doing that, and it was one particular day that we were wrestling, and my dad walked in. He got home early from work, and the second that he walked in, he started yelling at Ron. He told me to go to my bedroom, and I heard some more yelling. I didn't see Ron the rest of the day, and the very next day, my dad told me that Uncle Ron had to go on a business trip. I haven't seen Uncle Ron or heard anything about him since that incident, but my dad did fill me in on some important information. The thing he had originally been in jail for was sleeping with an underage girl. I guess Ron had claimed that he thought she was 18, and it was just a big misunderstanding. Of course, the family believed him and just excused it as if it was an honest mistake. My dad told me that, when he saw him wrestling with me, he didn't believe that story any longer. And that was the second he kicked Ron out of our life for good. Like I said, I don't know where he has been or what he's been up to, but I guess threatening the safety of his kids finally got my dad to cut ties for good.